Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today Jeskai month is coming to a close at, well, I think it's still Jeskai month. It might already be April when this comes out, so maybe going forward I'll just call this one the Arc of Jeskai. But for today, for the close of the Arc of Jeskai, we've got a fresh take on Breach. Before we get started though, thanks again for joining us. I don't usually get a chance to respond to everyone's feedback and comments, but it really does mean a lot, and it helps Gemstone Mine over here on CCO Media Group. And speaking of helping things out, you can help out your wallet with Outlaws of Thunder Junction and probably another 100 new sets coming out by the time this comes up by picking up singles you need from our sponsor, FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. If you're watching this episode on YouTube, you'll see the discount code has been updated. CCO Save is what gets you 5% off your order. It'll also be in the description for all of you audio-only folks who are enjoying this episode too. And yes, they do ship international. I have a few cards on my shopping list from the new set, plus I'm getting some other cards over to Ryan for a few altars. Those are going to look really cool when they're done, and I'll be saving some money doing it. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. So as we've established throughout our entire run on Jeskai month, Breach is a stable win con in this color identity, thanks to the slot-efficient and mana-efficient lines available to Jeskai. So another Jeskai Breach deck isn't inherently an absurd or really original concept, but this combination of Doctor and Companion does create a Breach deck which can have its own anti-Breach cake and eat it too. Our Doctor's Companion is Nissa of Traken, 3 and a blue for a 3/4 legendary creature human scientist with you have no maximum hand sized, and whenever Nissa of Traken attacks, sacrifice X artifacts. When you sacrifice one or more artifacts this way, tap up to X target creatures and you draw up to X target cards. The problem is that in most cases, you're probably using those cards for something. However, we can take a page out of the Razakats playbook and have the option to slow the game down with Stax effects, which we can then clear on our attack trigger with our commander, powering our opponents from using the same win condition that we ourselves are looking to exploit. In this case though, Nissa allows us to draw a fistful of cards when she swings, providing us an effect not unlike Ad Nauseam. Hence the deck name, Jeskai Midrange Ad Naus. Our Doctor, on the other hand, is the War Doctor. 2 red and a white for a legendary creature Time Lord Doctor, a 3/5 with whenever one or more other permanents phase out, or whenever one or more other cards are put into exile from anywhere, put a time counter on the War Doctor. Whenever the War Doctor attacks, it deals damage equal to the number of time counters on it to any target. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. So the War Doctor gets us Jeskai colors and technically represents a backup win con, but to be fair, there's going to be very few times when we expect to need to win with War Doctor beats. As expected for a deck with Nissa as one of our commanders, we're going to lean hard into artifacts for effects wherever possible. Nissa wants a lot of artifacts on the turn that she swings, so we can draw a lot of cards. And among mana rocks, there aren't going to be a ton of surprises here. We're running all the usual suspects in a cEDH mana rock package, as well as a few outliers. Mox Amber makes the cut because even if it doesn't get our commanders out much faster, they're both 4-drops, so we can't really take advantage of it the way that we could with a 1 or 2-drop commander. It still represents a 0 mana draw 1 on the turn we crack it with Nissa. And even if they represent card draw, we probably don't want to delay cracking our Lotus Petal or Jewel Lotus if it gets us where we need to go sooner though. I think there's also a real argument to be made here that we run more of the brown rituals. We're already running Grim Monolith and Mana Vault, because once we tap them, we don't necessarily care that we've used them up and never plan to pay to untap them. So we could potentially look at running something like Basalt Monolith. I don't have it in this version of the list, but it might be correct to include. Now, outside of mana rocks, we're also leaning into the more controlling aspect of Jeskai in this deck, because our commanders need more setup than a commander like Narset Enlightened Exile. The fact that our commander also destroys symmetrical Stax pieces on attack means that we have a lot of flexibility to include effects in our plan, which are normally antithetical to Breach. We get to run Grafdigger's Cage, Soulless Jailer, and Weathered Runestone, all of which can stop other Breach attempts directly, and we just have Nissa there to crack any or all of them open to draw cards when we decide to go for the win. Chalice of the Void, Aethersworn Canonist and Rug of Smothering all serve to hamper opponents' storm turns and can reasonably disrupt opponents who are behind. Of note here, I do think it's important to note that Chalice on 1 is probably a really good substitute for Silence on a turn we're trying to win, so you probably leave that intact. On the other hand, if you developed Chalice on 0 or Chalice on 2, you're going to need to be able to get through that, so you probably want to crack that for a card when Nissa attacks. Outside of the artifacts, we're still running all of the best in category Stax effects with cards like Draneth Magistrate, Blind Obedience, Dauntless Dismantler, etc., etc., etc. Of note, we are also on Torpor Orb because we can easily win around it. There are other useful artifacts that we are running. We're not going to skip the option to play really good value engines in this deck, like Esper Sentinel, and we are currently on Lightning Greaves, at least at the moment, because it gives us a haste enabler to let Nissa be played and swing out on the turn that we cast her. Now, the new Lava Spur Boots from Outlaws of Thunder Junction may actually be optimal over Lightning Greaves. It is a lot easier to access with effects like Urza Saga because it only has a mana value of 1, and while it does present an additional tax of 1 on the turn that we cast and swing with Nissa, Ward 1 is still pretty good, and honestly, haste is what we're here for anyway. And to be clear, whether it's Lightning Greaves or Lava Spur Boots, once Nissa is attacking, it doesn't matter that she loses haste, because she is already attacking. We're pulling a few tricks out of other decks as well. Portable Hole is a slow piece of interaction that still does a nice job of getting rid of someone else's early value pieces. Brass's Tunnel Grinder serves as another alternative to Brain Freeze and Grinding Station on breach turns, but gives us more play early on to sculpt our hands while still giving us another card draw when Nissa attacks. These includes are still looser and may need to be cut in the next iteration of the deck, but for now I have them in there and they've been doing some work. If you'll recall from Azorius Month, we had a mantra of, first, don't lose when you're playing a control deck. And in terms of gameplay, this deck is much more of a control deck than the classic Jeskai Turbo decks. We want to spend the early game developing our own mana and card advantage engines while establishing the Stax pieces which can slow down faster decks in a very classic mid-range plan. We're not going on full-on Stax or control, but we do want to give the faster turbo decks like Rogsai a hard time because, quite frankly, we're not going to outrace them. Grafdigger's Cage is the obvious all-star, which seriously limits the capabilities of a number of the fastest win cons in the format, including our own. But we're also on Weathered Runestone and Soulless Jailer as additional effects in this category. Our early game focus is on, number 1, having interaction, because again, rule number 1 in playing control is, first, don't lose. Number 2, landing a value engine that can help us get ahead on cards. And number 3, ramping ahead such that we can do both interacting and playing value engines. Now, normally when you have a card advantage engine in the command zone, you can be a little bit more loose with which card advantage engines you want to dig for in your opening hand. Nissa, however, is a little bit more all or nothing. You have to throw in a lot of resources that you've already developed in order to draw cards off of Nissa, and sometimes it's correct to do that. Just throw away everything you've already developed to draw a fistful of cards. It isn't always, though, and it takes some finesse to learn how the deck wants to play. Once we have our foundation, our goal is usually to land Stax pieces which limit the options our opponents have to actually go for the win. Rule number 2 of playing control, keep opponents manageable and predictable. We're leaning to more Stax pieces than the average Jeskai deck, and you'll need to have some idea of what your opponent's game plans look like. For example, Grafdigger's Cage is usually a phenomenal opening Stax piece. But if you're going up against 2 or more opponents with graveyard agnostic strategies, or there's decks that don't really rely on sneaking creatures directly into play from their library, you may want to mull for a different early Stax plan. And, as we discussed during Azorius Month, number 3, winning comfortably, Asterisk. Once this deck has established its speed bumps and its own advantage engines, the deck wants to cruise, generating value and developing a board full of rocks. Instant speed interaction is for when our opponents try to fight through our speed bumps. But once our window opens, this deck looks to get a lot more like a Razakats deck. Nissa will do a good Razakats impression, gobbling up all of our artifacts to draw a boatload of cards and open up our deck to be able to play Underworld Breach. In addition, putting those artifacts into the graveyard serves as fodder for Breach. I did say asterisk out loud because it is a very big asterisk next to winning comfortably. When I was preparing this deck, I goldfished the deck way too many times. It's just been a lot of fun, and I've discovered the sheer thrill of what I'm calling a blind Jeskai Naus. So to be clear, this deck cannot run ad nauseum. We don't have access to black. But we can draw tons and tons of cards on the turn that Nissa attacks. This blind Jeskai Naus, where you scrap your whole board of mana rocks and Stax pieces to draw dozens and dozens of cards and see if you draw the pieces you need to cobble together a win, it's really unlike anything else I've tried in cEDH. Nissa does also make it pretty trivial to get an additional stock of escape fodder into your graveyard for a breach, so if you lost a lot of pieces in your graveyard to something like a Calamity's Wake, it's not really a big deal. Now, in particular, Nissa's on-attack trigger does make top-deck tutors like Enlightened Tutor a lot more appealing. So we can go for lines where we go to combat, declare Nissa as an attacker, and with her trigger on the stack, tap all of our remaining mana rocks to float mana, tutor for Underworld Breach or Grinding Station, or whatever other piece we're missing from our hand to stitch together a win attempt. Usually the best practice with this deck, though, is to try to tap out mana rocks for your pre-combat spellcasting and leaving your lands to go for a breach line after combat. Sometimes, though, that's not the option that you have. That's not what the table is showing you, and you've got to try something a little bit more creative, which is a lot of fun, I'm not going to lie. We'll make an exception for this and float mana during combat if we already have one of our insurance policies in hand. Now, what insurance policies am I talking about? These are flash enablers like Born Upon a Wind, extra turn effects like Final Fortune, and then an unusual tech piece I wanted to play in this deck called Second Sunrise. Second Sunrise is 1 white for an instant with each player puts all permanent cards that were put into their graveyard this turn from the battlefield back into play. Obviously, we plan to use it in a one-sided manner, much akin to the classic Eggs decks from days of Modern gone by. It is an emergency reset button that we can hit if we fired off a blind Jeskai Naus and drew into absolutely nothing useful for a win attempt, getting back all of our stacks and mana pieces, and it does a fair impression of a virtual ritual by giving us a pseudo untap on our mana rocks. Born Upon a Wind is a little bit more classic at this point, being able to say, I have the mana that I tapped for during my combat step, use Born Upon a Wind to just play out the cards you drew at instant speed, and attempt to go for breach during combat. Finally, we are on the extra turn effects that I mentioned in our discussion about Jeskai as a color identity. Final Fortune and Chance for Glory, both of these instant speed extra turn effects give you that one extra turn to pull off your win, so if you're a little bit short on mana, sometimes these are the effects you'll use during combat to get that extra turn you need to go for your win with breach. Unlike other breach decks, we're generally going into a breach attempt with a hand that is stocked with spells from our pseudo Jeskai Naus. In most cases, this makes our win attempts much more comfortable. Trust in the deck when you're playing it. Drawing into another mana rock during mid-game grind is just another card you'll get to draw later when Nissa goes for it. As for strengths and weaknesses, our deck plays reasonably well around some of the worst defenders in the current metagame. Orcish Bowmasters is going to sting on the turn we go for it, particularly if our opponents catch us with a gotcha moment, but it's unlikely to actually stop us if we're confident that we're going to be able to force through a breach. Fortunately, Orcish Bowmasters has more or less forced Notion Thief into an early retirement, so there aren't a lot of other pressures on preventing those draws which can stop a Comfy Naus. And even those which don't stop us from cracking Stax pieces that would normally stop a breach attempt and then just going for it, because it's still a breach deck. And while we're hoping that our Grafdigger's Cage and similar Stax effects will convince our opponents not to play their own anti-breach deck and instead do something else with their turns, we still need to find answers to our opponent's pieces like Drannith Magistrate like any other deck would. We lack unconditional black tutors, so we rely on raw card draw to find our wins more than black inclusive decks. And as a Jeskai deck that leans more on artifacts than most, we feed Dockside Extortionist to a high degree. So we need to be ready for opponents to take advantage of this and have counters ready for it. So let's close things out by looking at some mulligans together. We can't be perfect, but I'll try to give some advice with caveats for seeding and matchup where I can. Our first opening hand consists of Ancient Tomb, Hallowed Fountain, Mana Vault, Fellwar Stone, Talisman of Progress, Intuition, and Dockside Extortionist. Our first opener is pretty sweet. We have the option to open with either Shocking and Hallowed Fountain, and then going Mana Vault, tap for 3 to play Talisman of Progress, tap for 1, which gives us the 2 that we need for a Fellwar Stone. This means on turn 2, we can drop Ancient Tomb, cast Nissa, and be ready to crack those 3 rocks and draw some cards on turn 3. Now, in a perfect world, we drop a big Dockside on turn 3 because our opponents have put a lot of mana rocks out and float a bunch of mana with Nissa's Trigger on the stack to cast Intuition, after we do our Jeskai Naus to get the other pieces we need to breach. Again, this would happen after we've drawn all those cards off of Nissa's attack trigger because we want to know with best knowledge what pieces we're going to look for when we go to Intuition. I'm cautiously optimistic with this hand, but we're going to need to be fast and hoping that our opponents can't do anything too terrible to us on turns 1 or 2. If we're stuck in the player 4 seat, I'm not sure that the speed this hand represents is going to be enough for us to really interact. Hand number 2 is a different take, and if we're going second, I actually really like this one. Gemstone Caverns, Windswept Heath, Marsh Flats, Silence, Draneth Magistrate, Blind Obedience, and Mindbreak Trap. Even lacking a lot of fast acceleration, I don't mind the idea of pitching Silence to give us a turn 0 Gemstone Caverns with the luck counter on it into fetching for a Tundra on turn number 1. Then we have the option on turn 1 to either play Blind Obedience or Draneth Magistrate. I think that if we are in seat number 2, Blind Obedience is probably the stronger play because it means players 3 and 4 are going to be stuffed farther and farther behind as their early game mana rocks are that much worse. On the other hand, if we are further back, we probably have to consider the responsibility of playing Draneth Magistrate to prevent someone from developing a real card advantage monster like Crom, Tevesh, or even a Timna or a Keenan on turn 2. We do have a little bit more interaction in the form of Mindbreak Trap, which gives us some game against someone going for a fast Naus. So again, if we're sitting really far back in turn order, we may have to keep a hand like this in order to protect ourselves. I don't know though. In seat number 4, I'm tempted to throw this back, but I think it depends on pod composition. I think that Blind Obedience gets much worse the further back you are in rotation, for the simple reason that many of your opponents would probably have already developed all of their mana rocks. Our next hand is Lotus Petal, Urza's Saga, Soul Ring, Talisman of Progress, Fellwar Stone, Aethersworn Canonist, and Dauntless Dismantler. Hand 3 offers some speed and some interaction, a nice blend, which was kind of what I was looking for when I built the deck. We're definitely dropping Urza's Saga and developing Soul Ring, but then I think our next plays depend on our seat. If we're going first, I think it'd be really strong to then tap Soul Ring for 2, cast Talisman, then play and crack that Lotus Petal for white, tap the Talisman for colorless, and play Dauntless Dismantler, which potentially puts our opponents miles behind us in seats 2, 3, and 4, as all of their mana rocks, again, are entering the battlefield tapped. Depending on what we top deck, we might then invest in making Constructs on turn 2 to make a later Nissa more valuable with her draw, and then either getting a Mana Crypt or Mox Opal on turn 3 with Saga to continue developing our game plan. In seat 2 or 3, developing an Aethersworn Canonist might be a little bit better, particularly if we're expecting something stormy out of a faster deck in seat order ahead of us. Our last hand consists of Urza's Saga, Mox Opal, Mana Crypt, Command Tower, Soul Ring, Brass's Tunnel Grinder, and Final Fortune. Hand 4 is potentially really hot. Again, I think developing Saga first with the sheer number of colorless mana rocks we can cast is worth it. Tap that Saga for Soul Ring, then lay down Mana Crypt and Mox Opal, tap out for a turn 1 Nissa. Especially in seat number 1, pushing that advantage seems really nuts. Turn 2, we push that advantage. Pay 2 with Urza's Saga to make a Construct, play Command Tower, and then we have an interesting choice to make. I think my preference here would be to crack all of our rocks in a Construct, leaving the Soul Ring intact. That means we draw 3 cards, then use Brass's Tunnel Grinder with mana from Command Tower and Soul Ring to dig up to potentially 6 cards deeper, and sculpt a hand that should carry us through turn 3 and beyond. We sack Mana Crypt over Soul Ring to avoid getting potentially bolted every other turn, and on turn 3, we anticipate getting either a Mox Amber or a Mox Diamond off of Urza's Saga, depending on what else is going on and what we saw off of that deep digging to get more cards into hand with Nissa. Essentially, we had a big mana advantage that we then turned into a big card advantage, to try to get ahead of our opponents and be the person who is going for the win fast. Something that Azorius doesn't get to do, but Jeskai definitely does. And that's going to close us out for the Arc of Jeskai here on Gemstone Mine. Thanks again for coming out to join us for it. I hope you enjoyed it. This deck is a lot of fun, but cards on the table, I am actually brewing a different version of this deck in Simic for my casual deck that I'm building right now. That pairs Nissa of Traken with the 4th Doctor. The idea behind it being to lean way more into way bigger draws off of a bunch of tokens from effects like Tireless Tracker, Tireless Provisioner, Lunas Cryptozoologist, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, Nuka-Cola Vending Machine, all of the best artifact token generators you can get in Simic colors, drawing heaps of cards, playing big, stupid creatures like Old Gnawbone, and just trying to go to town to clear out the game with something like Psychosis Crawler to damage our opponents out, or Altar of the Brood. I'll post that deck list down in the description too. It wasn't the focus of this, but it's something I really enjoy about trying to brew fringe decks for cEDH. Even if the deck seems like sometimes it may not quite make it, and it may not be one I'm going to bring to a tournament anytime soon, sometimes it shows me something that is really fun that I want to develop for my casual decks as well. It's not too hard to tune something down as well, particularly when you swap it to a different color identity, and it can still keep a lot of the fun that Nissa of Traken allows for. If you enjoyed either of these deck lists, let us know about it in the comments. Or if there's something else that's hot that you're brewing in Jeskai, let us know about it. On YouTube, we are part of Commander Cookout Media Group. You can also send us an email to gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com, or you can add us on Twitter, where we are at gemstoneminemtg. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.